Most people have no idea when cowboy boots were first invented because it's really confusing because people had been wearing pull-on boots all through the 1800s in the Americas, but it wasn't until the 1880s that cowboy boots really started to take on a life of their own after cavalrymen turned frontiersmen and outlaws evolved their military boots into its own distinct style on the American frontier with higher heels, ornate stitching, and pointier toes. But cowboy boots are not the only famous boot from the Wild West. On the bleeding edge of the frontier, miners, mill workers, and loggers living deep in the forest and in the mountains could not wear cowboy boots because they're too slippery, unsupportive, and actually dangerous to wear. They desperately needed a boot that could withstand everything these untouched lands could throw at them. And over time, a unique style boot developed in the West. These nearly indestructible boots were hand-sewn by small bootmakers like Otto White, who had just made it out to the West with his one-man boot shop. And to this day, over 100 years later, this style of boot is still arguably the most durable boot that money can buy. But this style of boot was ridiculously heavy and bulky and often had spikes all throughout the sole. And by the early 1900s, the Wild West had slowly become a lot more civilized, and a huge influx of population soon followed, with hopes and dreams of staking their own claim and fortune with the mining, logging, ranching, railroad, and all the industries that are needed to build a civilization. And plenty of opportunity to take advantage of those industries illegally. Where there's no roads, no rivers, and only game trails, you need the lifeblood of the West, mule packers. And these packers were the lifeblood of the West because it took a highly skilled mule packer with an experienced team of mules or horses that could make it over any obstacle, any downfall. And it wasn't just as simple as sitting on a mule and riding it up to the camp. A lot of times these packers had to hop off the mules and guide their mules through some of the most treacherous areas because these were not groomed trails. This is the Wild West where there was deadfall, there's steep rocks, there's impassable terrain. And a lot of times it was the only way that you could get some of these supplies deep into the West. And as the West continued to explosively grow through the early 1900s, so did the need for these packers and their mules. And it became very clear that they needed a boot that could keep up with that demand. And you'd think maybe cowboy boots were perfect for riding with leather soles for easy in and out of stirrups. The big open top would make them easy to take on and off. No laces on a cowboy boot so you don't get stuck in your saddle. But once you're off the horse, they were terrible. The leather soles were like hiking around on ice skates, had little to no support and very minimal arch support. On the other hand, these work boots, crazy amount of arch support for the long days and heavy loads, extremely durable construction, laced all the way up for ankle support, spikes for grip. But you could really only wear these on the job because you couldn't ride a horse in them. They'd clog up full of mud. They were too bulbous to really fit into stirrups. They needed something that combined the best of both of these boots to make a boot that could handle hiking in any terrain and ride any trail. They needed a boot that was specifically designed for these mule packers. And over time, that need pushed development of an extremely versatile Western style of boot that was known as the packer. But packers were not the only profession that found value of that on and off horse versatility. So did a lot of train robbers and outlaws. And for the next few decades, the packer boot exploded in popularity. But so did the technology that looked to threaten the need of these packing teams, with the first man flight in 1903, the Model T rolling off the assembly line in 1908, and horrific world events like World War I in 1914 and the Great Depression in 1929. So the world was a changed place by the 1930s, and in 1933, Roosevelt tried to do something about it with the New Deal. And this was an attempt to pull the US out of the Great Depression by creating the Civil Conservation Corps, where young men were put into government-funded jobs similar to the US Forest Service. Even after the invention of planes, trains, and automobiles, the Forest Service and the CCC were still heavily reliant on pack teams, which meant they needed a lot of reliable packer boots. But not just any packer boots, they needed the ultimate version of this boot, so they contacted a man who since the early 1900s had been slowly building a name for himself through the crucible of the West and was now known throughout the West for making some of the toughest boots in the entire world. This man was Otto White, the owner of the White's Boot Company that had grown from a small one-man boot shop to a full-fledged bootmaking company. So Otto took one of his most popular mining and logging boot shapes that just happened to have a little pointier western toe and a higher heel, and realized with some minor tweaks it would be the perfect blend of cowboy boot and work boot to make the ultimate packer boot for the US Forest Service and the CCC. And after 3 years of work, in 1936, Otto White releases one of the most impactful but also forgotten boots of the West, the White's Packer boot. But what was it about this boot that made it so good that even to this day, almost 100 years later, some of the top packers in the world still use White's Packer boots? Well, there's 7 main things that we're gonna go over that make this boot unlike any other boot in the world that completely changed the world. And what is this boot? Well, it's a collaboration between White's and Rose Anvil. The style is the Sundance boot because even before Robert Redford's passing, a huge inspiration of this boot was my love lifestyle of Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid all growing up. And with the recent death of Robert Redford, I wanted to pay just a little bit of homage to him because of how much impact that movie had on me growing up. And so unfortunate timing of the release of the Sundance boot, but also it gives us an opportunity to thank Robert Redford. And the colors this boot comes in is Red Dog, our exclusive blood core leather you can only get from us in our collaborations, and one of my favorite leathers that I've never used, I've always wanted forever, cinnamon wax flesh. They weigh 2 pounds 8 ounces, and they're made in Spokane, Washington, the exact same town that Otto White designed this Packer boot for the U.S. Forest Service almost 100 years ago. And these retail for $680 or $720 if you want the little toe bug. Not cheap, but I think you'll understand why. And if you do want a pair of these, they are super limited quantities, so if they're sold out by the time you're watching this, get on the email list link below for the next drop. No promises, but you never know. So what are the 7 things that make Packer boots so unique and distinct? Well, number 1 is pretty obvious. They made the Packer boot laced, like the work boots of the time, for more ankle support and walking in tough terrain, making the quick escape on the side hill, leading your horse, running away from the lawmen. It also locks your foot in the boot, whereas cowboy boots are inherently loose and sloppy because you can't tie them down. But one thing they did keep from the cowboy boots was this tall heel. So why the tall heel? Well, the heel of a cowboy boot gives the rider an anchor point in the stirrups. So they can leverage their body, put their weight on the body, their foot's not gonna slip all the way through. If a ride happens to turn into a rodeo, you do not want your foot slipping through the stirrup, trapping you on the horse as it flips you around and drags you through the county. Just like a cowboy boot, they cut the heel really, really sharp. And this is due, because a lot of people just think that cowboy boots have that for aesthetics, but it actually has some functionality. Because it helps you feel like you're walking a lot more naturally, because instead of that heel being extended all the way to here, where you're gonna be catching it every single step you take, causing premature wear, and more importantly, causing that heel to catch and your forefoot slapping down, which completely wears out boots, it wears out your body, which leads us to number 3, why the ridiculously high arch. Because work boots at the time, they had a really high arch because they had such a tall heel that allowed them to build up that arch support, which was vital for those long days carrying heavy gear for miles and miles and miles, because it allowed you to support the arch of the foot to prevent it from collapsing and wearing out your feet and your legs. It also allowed you to distribute the weight of all the gear that you're holding over a larger surface area inside of your boot. So when they raised the heel of the Packer boot to match the cowboy boot to help prevent your heel from slipping through the stirrup, the arch was also raised. And this boot definitely has the absolute highest arch of any boot I've ever worn. And I'll show you why when we get it cut in half. It's ridiculous. It's so insane. And to achieve all that, it all came down to number 4, the last. A last is a foot-shaped mold that the boot is built around that gives it its very distinct heel height, arch support, toe profile, and top-down toe profile. And to accomplish that goal of combining those 2 styles of boot, Otto White specifically designed this 690 last to combine the cowboy boot's pointy toe for easy in and out of the stirrups and heel to lock you in the stirrups with the work boot's arch support and overall work profile. And because of this 690 last, it feels unlike any other boot because it really does kind of combine a cowboy boot with a work boot. And I love that you can actually own a boot on the 690 last that was designed almost 100 years ago. But all these features and attributes are no good if the boot completely falls apart in a couple months. And I think that's why the U.S. Forest Service went to White's, because they were known for making some of the toughest boots in the entire world. And to this day, in my opinion, the most durable way to make a boot is White's hand-sewn stitch-down construction, which is the 5th thing that makes this boot so unique, because this method of making a boot is so rare and so hard that White's is really the only one doing it at any kind of scale in 2025. There's a few boot makers here and there that still do it, but at scale, White's is the only one. And this style of construction was developed over a century of trying to make the toughest boots in the world for the toughest jobs. So what is it? Well, it's kind of a combination where it's sewn like a Goodyear welt construction, where this extra strip of leather, like the welt, is sewn through the upper into the insole, locking all that together. But it takes it a step further than a Goodyear welt, because instead of just having that welt flat, this stitch down kind of welt is rolled over that stitch, protecting it from the outside world. And then, unlike a Goodyear welt where the upper is just trimmed off, the upper is utilized in a structural way by flaring it out like a stitch down construction and then sewn all the way through all those layers all the way to the outsole, which makes these boots redundant like a Goodyear welt, repairable like a Goodyear welt, but you get all the extra durability of a stitch down construction and the water and dirt resistance of a stitch down. And so that's why I think it's the most durable way that you can make a boot in the United States. I've yet to hear an argument that there's anything better. So for a Packer boot, an outlaw boot, it's about as good as you can get, because you do not want to lose a heel, you do not want to delaminate, you don't want to have any boot failures when you're hundreds of miles from the nearest boot shop. But the downside of that is it has to be done by hand, and it's very expensive compared to the giant machines that can sew a boot together in a few seconds. It's a very skill-intensive job, and so if you can't find people that want to do it, it just dies out. And it's one of the very last steps, so if you happen to screw things up on that last stitch completing the boot, the whole boot is shot and you got to start over. So that's a huge part of why these boots are so durable, but also why they're so expensive. And another thing that's lasted the test of time that people have forgotten about is number 6, toe bugs. Lots of people think that toe bugs are just straight decorative. But there is some functionality above being decorative, because cowboy boot makers, a lot of times they use the toe bug as their signature for their work. It also allows you to guide some of the creasing and rolling of folding, so you don't get one big crease pushing down on your toes, especially if you're in the saddle for 12 hours. And a lot of times it was backed by cording that added some extra durability and structure to the toe of the boot. And really the 7th and final thing is a little bit of a mystery, to be honest, because there's hardly any information, hardly any photos out there, and so I don't know what soles the original Packers used, but we do know for sure that the work boots at the time, they were way too big, too chunky, too luggy. The cowboy boots at the time, they had leather soles and were way too slippery. So if I'm being honest with you, I don't know what the actual Packers use for their soles. But what they do in modern times, and what I'm assuming they did in 1936 with White's Packers, they use a sole that's a middle ground between the flat leather sole and the heavy luggy sole by using a flat rubber sole. So you still get a lot of the traction caused by the rubber, but it's flat, so it's easy to slip in and out of your stirrups. You don't get stuck in your stirrups. But I have no idea for sure when they started using rubber soles. So now let's cut this boot in half, and I'll show you just how ridiculous the inside of this boot is and how they get that arch support the way it is, and really show you what's inside one of the boots that built the West. All right, we got it cut in half. It was not an easy job because of how ridiculous these boots are built. And if you want to help us out, support these kind of videos, give us a like, give us a subscribe. Check out these boots via link in the description, and it's a good way to support us, and you can actually own a piece of history, since White's has literally been making these boots for almost 100 years. Now, let's see what's inside. Now you can really see how ridiculous that hand-sewn construction is. See how this sews all the way through the upper to the inside of the insole, just like a cowboy boot, but then that welt is rolled over that stitch, protecting it, and then that's sewn all the way down through the sole. It's one of the coolest ways to make a boot, and there's so few people that actually do it. So then how do they build up so much arch support? Because you can see it's like the heel is almost a little bit lower than the actual arch. And I think that's what they mean by an underslung heel. So your heel is almost sitting in a pocket, and then the arch is built up with all these layers of leather. You've got your leather midsole and your leather insole, but what really builds up that arch is that leather shank that then is tapered really, really short right at the forefoot. You've got a little bit of extra built up arch support right there with that wedge. That's over an inch of leather in your arch supporting all that. And this arch is so extreme that they literally have to drive nails through the outsole into the arch to bind all that together, make sure it stays really firm. Because if you're in stirrups all day and you're putting all that pressure on there, you need about as tough and as built up of an arch as you can get, while still making it completely out of leather. And just look how crazy this drop is, from where your heel sits in that little bit of a pocket and then sharp drop down to your forefoot. That's why they had to specifically choose this last with the higher heel, build up all that arch with all this leather on the inside. And that's a huge part of the reason why this is one tough boot to break in. Because you've got to take your foot and make this boot conform all the way around your foot, all this hard leather, and completely beaten this boot into submission over a few weeks or months. It feels unlike any other boot that I've ever worn. But it is something you need to consider before buying this boot. And these boots were made in a time where comfort came well second to quality and durability. Worn by some of the toughest people in American history, rail workers, outlaws, miners, farmers, loggers, and especially worn by the lifeblood of the West, mule packers. So thank you guys for listening to me tell you one of the coolest and forgotten stories of the American West. If you do want a pair of these, check them out below, and thanks again to White's for being willing to do this project with me, and huge thanks to Robert Redford for being an inspiration to me in many ways, in many films, especially Butch Cassidy and a Sundance Kid. So thank you guys. See ya.